Hi guys, in today's Wisdom Wednesday, I'm going to talk about the holy grail of physical preparation for boxing, and that is a video on improving speed and power for boxing. If you haven't found the rest of my content before, then I would recommend checking out the Everything You Need to Know About Conditioning video and how to improve punch frequency in boxing. But today, we are going to focus on speed and power. I'm going to start by talking through a few myths that I've heard from both my time being a competitive amateur boxer myself, being around many boxing coaches, and having the experience of being in the strength and conditioning team for the Rio 2016 Olympics with the GB boxers. Myth number one is weights make you slow. I would say that training slow only makes you slow if that's all you do. So for example, myself, I'm now competing in powerlifting. That is all I do. The reason why I might not be as quick as I used to be in my boxing days is because I'm not doing any training that allows me to express those fast, explosive qualities. So it's not the weight training makes you slow, it's that if that is the only stimulus you're giving to your body, obviously your body is going to adapt to it. Also, the second part of this is this completely ignores what kind of context you're lifting the weights. So if you look at, for example, the sport of Olympic weightlifting, so the snatch and the clean and jerk, you will find some of the most explosive athletes in the world. That's because they're lifting a reasonable amount of weight, but they're doing it as explosively as possible because they need to get under the bar to either catch it on their shoulders or to throw the barbell above their head. If you're interested, just go on YouTube and you'll find videos of Chinese weightlifters jumping onto boxes or stacked plates higher than what you'll see in most normal gyms. But it depends how you lift the weights, what weights you're using, the rep scheme, and what else is forming part of your training. This is also a worry for more endurance athletes who worry that weights will make them bulky. But again, if the majority of your training is presenting one stimulus and then you're doing 1 or 2 weight sessions a week, your body's probably going to adapt to the overall stimulus. So if we're using weights to improve our boxing performance, it either needs to be relatively heavy, but in the low rep range, so 1 to 5, because this is going to avoid taxing us to the point where we're going to improve muscle mass. So using myself as a personal example, even though I've been lifting for 7 years now, I've lifted for 7 years, stopped boxing for 10 years, I've put on 11 kilos in 10 years of lifting weights. So if you think you're going to do 3 sets of 10 for 3 weeks and turn into the next Arnold Schwarzenegger and it's going to interfere with your boxing performance, not going to happen. The second myth is that if it looks like a punch, it must be improving it. And on the flip side, if it doesn't look like a punch, then it won't improve your performance. Now, this is poor logical thinking on a couple of bases. The first one is that just because something looks like the movement doesn't mean it improves it. And in fact, in some cases, it can actually even make it worse. So firstly, we'll talk about dumbbell punching. This is something I've covered on my podcast, Platform to Perform podcast with Yaspar, which I'll link in the description below. If I'm holding heavy dumbbells, the direction of the force when I throw the punch is acting down because of a thing called gravity. Now, in boxing terms, I'm not really resisting gravity apart from to hold my hands up. So if you're using, for example, dumbbell punching for a little bit of localized shoulder conditioning, I mean, I'm not completely against it, but if you're using dumbbell punching, you're adding weight to slow down the movement and you're telling me it makes you faster, I'm going to question that. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally appreciate the psychological impact of punching with a heavier weight, and then you take the heavier weight out and then you start punching either with just boxing wraps or gloves, then maybe, but are you actually getting faster? Are you actually measuring your arm speed? Because, for example, if I'm sprinting with a sled and then I take that off, I can easily measure, am I getting faster? And actually, sprinters might use sled work to improve their acceleration mechanics because they're going to spend longer on the floor during acceleration than when they're in upright running. They're not using it for psychological benefits if you take the sled off and then all of a sudden you're faster. They're using that to load the position, very similar to a position they're going to be in when they're actually sprinting, whereas in boxing, it could throw off the mechanics, whereas in acceleration, a lot of the force production is horizontal, so it makes sense to get horizontally strong by sprinting with a sled behind you, so to speak. this is another one I love. If someone else is doing it, it must be right. A lot of elite athletes are unbelievable, oftentimes in spite of their training rather than because of it. Even if you look at some of the stuff that Anthony Joshua does, and a lot of elite athletes, you might see a 2-second clip where Anthony Joshua, whoever it is doing a certain kind of training modality. That's 2 seconds of their entire training history. When I was with the GB squad, I remember there was a regional netball team who were also training in the same facilities, not at the same time, and there were girls who were hip thrusting more weight than what I'd seen Anthony Joshua do in the gym. So just because Anthony Joshua does do something doesn't mean it's correct. Just because he doesn't do something doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. But you need to be speaking to their coaches to understand why they're doing it, where it fits in their training program. And something I heard on a podcast I listened to a while back is you probably don't need to be looking at, for example, Anthony Joshua and seeing what is he doing now. If you've, for example, just started boxing, you probably want to find out what certain boxers were doing when they were the same age or the same experience level as you. Likewise, you'll get boxers like Anthony Joshua who are an unbelievable physical specimen and probably have got to the top a lot in part due to their athletic qualities. And you'll get other boxers who aren't as athletic, but they are unbelievably technically gifted. So let's also bear that in mind whilst we're on that subject. The final one is that punches are born, not made. Now, don't get me wrong, there is going to be a ceiling to every athlete's development in certain areas due to genetic components. Now, there are far less chemical steps in the anaerobic pathways, so the stuff that fuels explosive activities. So from a certain perspective, it's harder to improve these speed and power qualities than what it is to improve more endurance type qualities. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because you're not naturally explosive, you never will be. It has a lot to do with your training stimulus. As I said, if you're doing, 10 endurance sessions a week, no strength and power work, then obviously your body's going to adapt to being more of an endurance athlete. But we'll dive more into that in a second. So what is speed and power, and why is it different in boxing? Should we be training like sprinters? I've made the case in previous videos that boxing is probably more similar to a 400 to 800 meter if we're going to put it as a track event. Some boxers will fall more towards the explosive end, some will fall more towards the endurance end, and sometimes your training program is going to be developed in line with what type of boxer are you. Are you the type that needs to go 12 rounds and needs to have a big engine? Equally, are you the kind of boxer who can get people out in 1 or 2 rounds but needs to perhaps prolong the amount of time you can sustain this for? If you're interested in that kind of content, then I will put a link in the description below as to how you might train those two boxers differently. So what underpins speed and power? We need to connect the foot to the fist. So any exercises that allow us to link the whole kinetic chain, aka the body being as one piece, in explosive actions are going to be useful for us. If we talk about contributing factors, we need, the analogy I like to use is thinking of the boxer as a car. So you need the gears. So basically, you need to be strong and powerful. You need to have an engine to be able to repeat this explosive activity, but you also need to be able to drive the car. I love the thought of, for example, maybe using strength and conditioning for Floyd Mayweather and thinking, how are you going to improve someone who's so technically efficient? To be brutally honest, maybe strength and conditioning could have stopped him breaking his hands or having as much difficulty with his hands as he had during the latter portion of his career, but it'd be lies for me to tell you that a strength and conditioning coach is going to come in and improve his actual boxing performance. This goes back to what I was saying previously, is just because something looks like a punch doesn't guarantee it improves punching performance. And on the flip side, just because it doesn't look like a punch doesn't mean it's not. So we have things called first, second and third order effects, or what's called a primary transfer of training, secondary transfer of training and tertiary transfer of training. These are fancy ways of describing at what level is your training impacting your sport. So a primary transfer of training is something that improves the skill of the actual movement itself. So for example, if you've got a complete novice and you're teaching them how to set their stance to throw a right hand, it's a primary transfer of training because they can then literally drag and drop that coaching of the right hand into something like sparring or a fight. A secondary transfer of training is mostly where strength and conditioning lies. It's improving the physical qualities that underpin that skill. So if we look at something like a boxer throwing a right hand, or even a left hook. If there's restrictions in hip mobility, or for example internal and external rotation, which you'll often see with boxers normally in their stances. So for example, even from my boxing career, if you want to call it that, my left pec is typically tighter than my right one, just because it's used to guarding my chin. So this tightens up as a result, and typically you'll find, because of the sling system in the body, if something's tight on the left side, so for example my left pec is pretty tight, then typically my right hip will also be slightly tighter as well. So my right hip will be in relative external rotation, which means that the muscles that externally rotate the hip, so for example the piriformis or just above the glute, is also going to tighten up as well. Now to a certain extent, these asymmetries or these differences are needed as a byproduct of the sport. If you think about someone like Rafael Nadal, it's no shock that his left arm is visibly more muscular than his right arm. But if these differences get too large, that's when we're looking at imbalances and potentially where we're looking at injury risks. So it's something that we need to manage. But a secondary transfer of training effect would be improving the physical qualities that underpin that punch. So for example, whether it's the triple extension, where the hip, knee and ankle straighten as you punch, whether it's the mobility of the hips and shoulders to be able to rotate, whether it's the ability to connect foot to fist, so whether we're transferring force from the ground up, anything which improves the physical qualities that underpin the punch is a secondary transfer training effect. I would argue the most strength and conditioning falls in this area. When you see people trying to sell stuff on Instagram where they're talking about banded punches or dumbbell punches, most of the time that's a bit of a gimmick. It's trying to sell you it because it looks like it. Whereas for example, if we get you strong in a squat pattern or even a jumping pattern, we've still got that triple extension which you see in the punch, but it doesn't guarantee that just because you have the physical qualities, you're going to see them transfer over to the punch. On the flip side, however, you can't use a physical quality you don't have. In the GB team, there was no surprise that those who were the fastest sprinters were also tending to be the ones who had reasonable knockout percentages. Anthony Joshua had the fastest 30-meter time of any Olympian ever tested over the last 8 years across 30 meters. Joshua Buatsi wasn't far behind him. Fraser Clark also had very impressive jump metrics. Buatsi, 2016 Olympics, stopped his first couple of opponents. Again, no surprises there. And we're also going to talk about training to improve it. So when we know that we have strong correlations between jump performance and sprint performance, metrics which are heavily reliant on lower body power, it's no surprise that we see that this transfers to punching performance. But again, just because you have one doesn't mean you guarantee the other. If you've got someone with impressive jump metrics, but they've never been taught how to throw a punch before, doesn't mean they're going to succeed in a ring. And this is why, for example, someone like Mayweather, who, yes, impressive punch statistics in the early part of his career, but I remember thinking when I first started strength and conditioning, if I just get an athlete to clean more or jump more, they'll automatically punch harder. Not necessarily the case. Again, it gives us a physical foundation to that, but it doesn't guarantee it. Finally, if we talk about tertiary transfer of training, this is where you're improving a physical quality that then allows you to do more of a certain thing, which then allows you to physically improve performance. So for example, if by improving robustness around the posterior shoulder, the back of the shoulder, which is a risk factor for boxing, then allows you to develop more strength around the shoulder, and because you've got more strength and robustness there, it allows you to endure more technical training, then you're improving performance. So it's almost like, because you've improved general robustness or injury resilience, that allows you to train more, and it's the training more, i.e. technical training, that allows you to improve your the speed and power in the ring. So it's tertiary because it's almost 2 steps away. It's not that, for example, by being able to do more press-ups and more pull-ups, you automatically become a better fighter, but by doing so, it might improve your shoulder health, which might reduce your injury risk and allow you to train more, and it's the improved amount of technical training that it takes that improves punch speed or punch power. If you want to be a professional athlete at any level, you need to endure a hell of a lot of training. Whether you agree with the 10,000 hour rule or not, no one can deny that to get to the elite level in any sport, you're going to need to endure a lot of training. So let's talk about speed versus power. I said earlier about whether we should be training boxers like sprinters, 400 meters, or even 800 meters. We can't afford to have boxers who are too much like 100 meters because they're going to gas out in the early stages, but equally we can't afford to be too endurance based where we're not powerful enough or explosive enough to punch hard enough to keep our opponents off us. Speed is simply distance divided by time, so we do want our boxers to express explosive qualities. By being able to sprint technically well, we can overload the heart and the lungs, which means that by having overloaded the heart and the lungs, the heart can pump more oxygen to the working muscles, which means we can achieve higher outputs, which means we can put the body under more lactate, which means we can also get the body used to clearing more lactate. And we can basically have those repeated spikes of intensity and a greater chance to endure these. Now, with heavier boxers, we might choose to use something like a watt bike to avoid the stress on the foot and ankle complex, but sprinting is an incredibly useful skill for boxers because it allows them to overload the heart and lungs. This is why I would partially consider training a boxer like a sprinter if they're in the early stages of their career, so whether it's youth boxers or boxers who, for example, are close to turning over, then we can start to feed in that technical work. If a boxer's getting towards the end of their career and they're first starting strength and conditioning, then maybe teaching the technical aspects of sprinting and getting the mobility, flexibility and coordination might take a little bit too long. So it entirely depends on which kind of boxer we're training. Finally, we need to assess, not guess. So you hear boxers say all the time, I'm in the best shape of my life. But do they have numbers to it? There's a great interview with Carl Froch where he talks about his training diary. Moving into the Groves fight, he knows he's repeated certain runs and not just your boring 5Ks, which don't really transfer to performance, but he's got a diary of I'm lifting this weight, so I'm achieving these speeds, so he knows he's getting faster and more powerful. And a quick word on the conditioning philosophy, because at the end of the day, even if we think about fast and explosive punches, it's all on this spectrum of conditioning. We've got 3 energy systems. Again, I've gone over this in several different videos. If you listen to my first ever Platform to Perform podcast, it goes over the conditioning mistakes I made as a boxer and this in a little bit more detail. But we've got our fast and explosive activities, which are powered by the ATP PC system. These are like a match. You light it, it's a quick release of energy. It's very rapid, but it's over very quickly. So this would be the energy system you would use if you wanted to knock someone out. You've then got your glycolytic system. This is explosive actions which are nearly maximal and are sustained for a little bit longer. So this would be anything between probably 10 and 60 seconds, give or take. Finally, so that would be like a newspaper. You light it, it lasts a little bit longer than a match, but not quite as long as wood. If you light wood, it takes a little bit longer to get going, but it's also more sustainable. This is similar to your aerobic system. So this is the type of system you need to develop in order to be able to do 12 rounds. Whereas your glycolytic system is what I call the stoppage system. It's where you're developing a powerful system where you can pin someone against the ropes, hold near maximal intensity and force a stoppage. The reason why I've got this philosophy written out is because it explains why I would prefer certain conditioning modalities over others. So the goal of an energy system development program should be the highest intensity efforts possible, repeated with the greatest frequency possible. Why would I want to train boxers to go all day at a pace that is flat? Now, I know I said that boxing might be similar to a 400 meters or an 800 meters, but in reality, it's more like a series of repeated sprints. So it might be, for example, you got a 3 to 5 second burst of punches, move around the ring, avoid the opponent. 3 to 5 second burst of punches, move around the ring, avoid the opponent. So we're looking for the highest intensity possible with the greatest frequency. Even if your tactical game in boxing isn't reliant on out-punching the opponent, I believe the best boxers have the most rounded game, and when shit hits the fan, if you need to go for the knockout, then you're probably going to need to accumulate a high volume of punches, or at least be explosive enough that your punches are going to mean something. So whose job is it to improve punching power? Now, in my earlier days, I'd have said some of these are definitely the result of the S&C coach. Some of these are definitely the responsibility of the boxing coach. but there's no reason why, for example, stuff like mobility around the hips and shoulders can't be taken care of in the warm-up. Likewise, there's no reason why, even though you would argue it's the boxing coach's role to improve technique, there's no reason why the boxing coach and the strength and conditioning coach can't be discussing what they're seeing in technical movements. It might be, for example, that a boxing coach sees that a boxer lacks rotation around the hips, and this may be impacting the power of their hooks, whilst the strength and conditioning coach might assess this and realise that there's a limitation there. Although certain equipment might lend itself to developing these qualities more, as long as you know the adaptation that you're going for, in my mind, you could easily manipulate any of these variables to work on them in a technical session. For example, boxing science have some decent research that shows that effective mass of the core, so how much musculature there is around the core, is directly correlated to punch power. So there's no reason why we can't implement specific core exercises to deal with this. Now, I'm not talking about stuff like sit-ups, because when in boxing do we repeatedly flex the spine? You might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, we don't really do a side plank in the ring. But, for example, if we're slipping a shot, we need to maintain stability through that trunk so that when we reload the hips, we're not leaking energy and we're transferring as much power from the foot to the fist. Again, I think that all of these things are reliant on both the boxing coach and the strength and conditioning coach, and it's about bringing that together so that, for example, the boxing coach isn't doubling down on what the S&C coach is doing, and likewise the S&C coach isn't draining the boxer when, for example, he's got hard sparring coming up. It's probably a yin and yang relationship where, for example, further out from the fight day, the strength and conditioning coach is taking priority and almost overseeing most of the training. I don't mean in the sense of that you're seeing the S&C coach for more sessions than the boxing coach, but what I mean is, if there's a decision to be made, it's probably the S&C coach who should be saying, at this time we need these qualities, whereas closer to the fight, the most important thing has to be the boxing skill itself. But if you've built the appropriate physical foundation further away from camp, when sparring starts to get hard, then the S&C coach can back off because those qualities have already been built. Now, there's definitely an argument that, for example, if you look at fighters back in the day, Muhammad Ali, maybe they sparred rounds that were so difficult that that's where they got their conditioning from. Also, there's an argument that there's no point of building up such an engine or such explosive gears on the track through, say, your sprints and your road work if you can't translate it into moving around the ring. But this all comes down to which boxer you're working with, how well are both coaches working together, how well does the boxing coach know what the S&C coach is doing, how well does the S&C coach know what the boxing coach is doing. The final reason why I put all of these qualities on there, and there's definitely more, is that we need to know what is contributing to punch power. So, for example, I've heard from people who've been in the camp with Floyd Mayweather say he actually hits a lot harder than what his record may suggest. But a lot of this is down to timing. If you're hitting someone with a shot that their body is not prepared for, that shot feels a hell of a lot harder. Likewise, there may be boxers who, for example, as I've said, score really well on their metrics that are correlated to punch power, so lower body strength, lower body power, sprints, jumps, but then you don't see it in the ring. Again, maybe it's a timing issue that they telegraph their punches so much that you can see it coming. So when I said about training boxers as sprinters, this is a flowchart from Jared Deacon, who was a 400-meter athlete who went to the Commonwealth Games. Although this is presented as a pie chart, as a flowchart, sorry, I would look at this more as a pie chart. So what I mean by that is, it's not that we do range of motion work or ROM work, and we only do that, and then once we got it, then we add strength, and then once we got it, then we add technique, then we add power, then we add speed. I would look at this more as a pie chart, and how much of each factor you assign to in training is going to be largely dependent on a lot of things. For example, what are the athlete's limitations? If you've got 12 weeks or even 6 weeks or even less for an amateur fighter to prepare them, you're probably not going to do 6 weeks of mobility work and no strength work, no speed, no power work. Likewise, on the flip side, if you've got young boxers, I don't know, 11, 12, it's going to be worth teaching them how to sprint, because if they're staying in the game for the long haul, then being able to sprint technically well will mean they can overload their heart and lungs, and they can start playing about with more explosive types of training. So what are the athlete's limitations? What are the logistical implications of when competitions are coming up? What are the limitations in terms of the equipment you have, training times per week, and stuff like that. This is why I like micro-dosing training. So for example, in my mind, there's no reason why, for example, a boxing coach couldn't chuck in some acceleration work or some 5, 10, 15 meter sprints as part of a warm-up outside of the boxing club. There's no reason why, for example, you can't be getting your boxers used to being explosive by doing light jumps or plyometric work. As I said, stage of the season and career also plays a part. If I've got a boxer, a 45 veteran in the professional rank, and he's never done strength and conditioning, I'm probably not going to spend a load of time teaching him how to perform the technical side of Olympic weightlifting or the technique side of, say, sprinting. I might, however, get him on a watt bike to produce those high intensities and use that for the conditioning element. There's also obviously the notion of fatigue. If, for example, a boxer looks fantastic and is incredibly explosive in the first round, but then they die of death in the second round, then I've got to be assessing whether or not actually maybe this boxer is already explosive. I just need to give him a bit more conditioning. So what are the contributing factors to power? Force equals mass times acceleration. Most boxers are bound by their weight class, which is fine. But one thing that needs repeating is how much of your mass is fat versus muscle. There's a saying that fat don't fly. If, for example, you've got a 74 kilo boxer or whatever, and they put on 2 kilos of muscle, but they've lost 2 kilos of fat, they're in the same place. Now they've increased their effective mass, and what I mean by that is mass that can actually contribute to the punching power. The more muscle, the larger a muscle is, the more force it can produce. The more force it can produce, the more potential it has to be explosive. This doesn't mean that just because you were hitting bicep curls, you suddenly automatically become more explosive. But what I mean is there's still the potential for that to be used. There's also mass times velocity, so the rate of speed change. So we've got a couple of options. Either A, we improve effective mass, so how much of you is muscle. B, we improve your velocity and the speed at which you can move. Or C, we improve both. Now, it's often said that power is the last thing to go. I don't know whether this is actually true, but I've seen, for example, Mike Tyson doing charity events, obviously not the recent one against Roy Jones, but I've seen him drop people having been years out. I do wonder whether there's a psychological thing. If you know you've always dropped people, you'd carry that confidence. But I would say if you don't use it, you lose it. If you stop training your explosive fast twitch fibers, so for example, myself, I've lifted weights now for 7 years. My standing long jump has improved, so my lower body power maybe has improved as well, but the speed qualities aren't there the way they were. In terms of contributing factors, sequencing the foot to the fist, so this is any explosive activities that involve the release phase of something like a medicine ball, are also going to help us. So what should we be doing to train speed and power? We have several options available, and you'll see that a lot of these don't really need that much equipment. So we've got plyometrics and ballistics. Plyometrics are any exercise that involve a quick rebound or quick release phase, so any jumps that involve you hitting the floor and rebounding. With our medicine ball work, it'd be anything. A ballistic exercise would be something where we're trying to move as explosively as possible. This is also why strength training alone only takes us so far. If we think of a lot of old school boxing coaches characterize power as strength times speed, but then we'll also say that weights make you slow. Go figure. Ballistic exercises are perfect complement to our strength work, because even when we squat, even when we deadlift, even when we bench press, naturally we're going to get a deceleration component to the lift because we have to stop the barbell from leaving our body. If I'm bench pressing, at some point my shoulders have to decelerate, Otherwise, you're literally going to have your shoulders fall out of your sockets. On the subject of this deceleration component, if you look at professional boxers or anyone in the GB system, you'll notice they have massive backs because the back acts to decelerate the arm as a punch is thrown. But we've got plyometrics, which are rebound type exercises. So for example, catch and release med ball exercises, so med ball slams, med ball punches. Plyometrics, so anything with a quick contact time, like a drop jump, skipping to a certain extent depending on how fast the contact time is. And we also have strength training. If you can produce more force, you also have built the foundation to produce more force more quickly. But if you can't produce much force at all, no one cares how quickly you produce it. On a final note, a lot of boxing coaches start this almost the wrong way around for me. They start training speed and power by fatiguing boxers too much to the point where they are no longer as explosive as possible, and they do no man's land training. This is the kind of training that feels difficult, but the quality has dropped. So for example, if I said to you, right, sprint 20 meters as fast as you can, you might do that in, I don't know, around 3 seconds if you're any good. But if I said to you, right, 30 seconds later, you're going to repeat it again, maybe you get 22 seconds or whatever. If I said repeat it 20 seconds later again, you might get 25 seconds. If repeated 30 seconds again, you get 27. It still feels difficult, but if your speed, your best speed is up here, after the first interval you're down here, now you're down here, now you're down here. Still feels difficult, but it's no longer quick enough to get you more explosive. This is where we need to consider the stress of the training session itself, what we're trying to get out from it. Too many times I hear boxers say, oh yeah, what are we trying to get out of this? Oh, mental. We want to improve our mentality. We want to make it hard work. But why? Why does it need to be hard? Proper sprint sessions, so for example, where you're resting for 1 minute for every 10 meters covered, they don't feel that hard in comparison to being in the ring. But if we look at the speed, that is intense on our system. This is why I like to employ something known as a high-low system. So high quality training stress, so this is your sprints, your explosive medicine ball work, any lift that is above 90%, and then the next day should be something low. Low doesn't necessarily mean that you're just walking. Low just means in terms of your best intensity, it's a lot lower down. So even though, for example, let's say you're running at, say, 80% for argument's sake, might feel difficult, but in comparison to sprinting, it's very easy. So how should we do this? If we're doing speed and power stuff, we need full recovery. If we're sprinting, we're looking at a 1 minute rest for every 10 meters covered to allow that speed to still be there. We would probably employ a high-low system where we have a day of high training stress and the next day is low training stress. This is why the boxing coach and the S&C coach need to be in contact with each other. Because, for example, if the boxing coach is doing a day of hard sparring on the Monday, if you're doing a sprint session on the Tuesday, you're still fatigued, you're not going to be in a sufficient place to be able to sprint maximally, and therefore you're not going to get faster. Anything less than 95% full speed, you're not getting faster. Now, there may be reasons why we'd use slightly longer sprints, but I've covered those in different videos. We need to avoid the middleman training. So what I mean by that is stuff that feels hard-ish. It either needs to be, in my opinion, maximal, or it needs to be so sub-maximal that we can recover quickly enough. So either we're sprinting fast, we're throwing medicine balls as fast and as hard as we can, or we're lifting relatively heavy, or we're doing more aerobic work. So this, even in a boxing sense, we might have hard sparring in the evening after doing pure speed work in the morning. And then the next day we might have light technical work on the pads, and we might have more of some lower intensity circuits on the next day. And then we go high, low, high, low, high, low. If you think you can just go high, 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 and your body's not going to break, quite frankly, you're an idiot. So this is how I would look at an overview of potentially a 12-week camp. Again, there's a lot of context potentially missing here, so if you've got any questions, feel free to email me at platformtoperform@gmail.com. So my first phase, I would be looking to improve a boxer's ability to accept force. So here I'm training the ability to decelerate, the ability to inhibit what's known as the Golgi tendon organ. So this is a fancy way of describing the overprotective mother of the body. Whenever you put yourself in a position that the body or the brain thinks you could potentially hurt yourself, the body shuts down power output. So let me give you an example. If you're performing two-phase attacks as part of your boxing, so let's say you throw a 1-2 or whatever, you push out and then you push back in. If that's too much force going through the foot and ankle, you'll see the heel probably drop. The ability to rebound into the second phase is going to be slow because the body's just shut down your power output. In the first phase, I'd be looking to get as strong as possible so we can inhibit this overprotective mother by developing our strength and by consistently placing stress on the body in terms of heavy lifting, in terms of proper landing technique from slightly higher heights, and sprinting. We improve the body's ability to accept force. We dampen this overprotective mother, and it's basically like we're loading the spring of the body. Or if you think of this as pulling the slingshot back, the more we desensitize the overprotective mother of the system, so the more we get our body used to sprinting, used to landing, used to handling heavier load, the better we're able to load that spring or to load that slingshot. In phase 2, we can improve the elastic rebound of the athlete. So we've built a base of strength. We've through stuff like squat variations, deadlift variations, heavy pushing and pulling exercises. We've got the foot and ankles stiff by getting used to landing almost with a what I call a credit card landing. So when we land, the heels are slightly off the ground to develop that calf stiffness, and we've improved the strength of our legs and our core in the first phase. The second phase is our ability to react and respond. So for example, we're shifting moderate loads lighter and faster. So built the base of strength. Now we're going to go into what's called either a strength speed or a speed strength block. So we're lifting heavy. Now we're looking at shifting moderate to light loads fast. In our so we're looking at the maximum force you can produce, ideally in as short a time frame as possible. Although we need the strength base, those are typically high loads, and it's going to be relatively slow because it's high loads. Now we take that strength, now we're adding a bit of speed and a bit more explosiveness. So in the first phase, we might be using stuff like squat variations, deadlift variations, bench variations. In the second phase, we're adding the explosive release phase. So whether it's a jump squat, whether it's a trap bar deadlift with a jump, whether it's medial throw variations, Smith machine, bench press throws, there's an explosive release phase. And in phase 3, we're looking at repeating that explosion. So we've already learned how to sprint in the first phase, we've already learned how to jump and rebound in the second phase, and now we're seeing how well conditioned we can be. I mentioned earlier that I felt like boxing is more of a repeated sprint sport rather than the same pace for 800 meters, and you'll see how this breaks down in the program I'm about to show you. So the first phase, I want my boxers sprinting, I want them strength training, I want them to get as explosive as possible in short bursts, and I want them to improve what's known as their rate of force development. But there's no point worrying about how quickly you develop force if you don't produce that much force in the first place. So I've also mentioned in my improving punch frequency video that in a nutshell, you need to lift heavy, you need to sprint, and you also need to be able to expose your body to high levels of lactate. But we'll never get to the longer sprints if we don't train the shorter duration sprints. So that's why in the first phase we're looking at plyometrics, so low level plyometrics, so hurdle hops, double leg jumps, conditioning the foot and ankle to shorter sprints, and exposing the hamstrings to a little bit of stress in the short sprints before we open up the full stride. So because we're working on say 10 to 40 meter distances, we're working for approximately 3 to 10 seconds. We're not putting the hamstring under maximal sprinting stress just yet. We're also building up. So this is where we're training slightly like a sprinter, whilst also keeping a explosive and strength element in with our plyometrics and our heavy lower body lifts. Remember, the lower body strength is heavily correlated to acceleration and getting off the mark quickly. So this is why in phase 1 we want maximal intent with multi-joint movements, so sprints, jumps, lifting heavy with the lower body. We're going to give ourselves full recovery. This is not about feeling tired. In fact, these sessions you should leave the gym feeling almost better than what you walked in. We're going to lift heavy, we're going to learn to land properly and develop the body's ability to stiffen up on impact. So when, for example, we improve our two-phase attacks, we are improving our ability to stop on a dime, because the ability to slow down and stop will then make the body feel safe enough to explode, load, rebound. So strength is our foundation here. However, we're also going to work both ways. So this picture you can see on your screen is known as the force velocity curve. We want to shift that up and to the right. So we want to produce more force at higher velocities. So basically we're punching with more force, but we're also punching with more speed as well. By learning the mechanics of sprinting, this will allow us to sprint faster, and by building this foundation, it will also allow us to hold on to that speed of that rate of activity for longer. So by taking care of both ends, we effectively are picking the low-hanging fruit. If you don't produce very much force to begin with, there's no point seeing how quickly you can produce that force. So we take care of the maximal strength side of things, we focus on pure speed work, we give a lot of rest for both activities to allow us to express those highly explosive qualities. So here's some example sessions. Now the reason I've split these up, as you can see, is because, as I said earlier, some of these will lend itself more towards microdosing throughout the boxing week. Some of them might lend themselves more openly to your strength and conditioning sessions. So for example, we might be doing aerobic plyometrics prior to our sprint work. So this is just conditioning the foot and ankle at a low level, but with higher volumes. And then as the phases go on, we choose more intense jumps and bring the volume right down. By using extensive med ball works, that means higher repetitions, and by introducing a catch element, we can also train the shoulders to decelerate, which is effectively like loading that spring, and then in phases 2 and 3 we get used to recoiling that spring. So we could do our aerobic plyometrics, so higher volumes, so you're looking at, for example, 10 to 30 seconds of work, 10 to 30 seconds of rest, with less stressful variations such as low level hurdle hops, low level hurdle jumps, or simply jumping on the spot with our toes up. Something like a box jump or a box jump and stick, box squat, and a box jump and stick. So we're developing our strength, our ability to land, our ability to build breaks in. And then even something like a bench press with a medicine ball throw. So we're pairing similar exercises together to improve the strength on one side and the landing or the rate of force development on the other side. Equally, stuff like bicep curls or tricep dips. This is just for a little bit of conditioning around the elbow and providing a little bit of protection to the forearm, because wrist issues and elbow issues are common in boxing. So you can see how, for example, that could be one session-ish maybe, or we can microdose it. So for example, we might do those sprints, those medicine ball throws, those plyometrics as part of our boxing warm-up. We might do the jump and stick or the medicine ball throws again as part of our boxing warm-up. By this way, rather than having either one elongated strength and conditioning session or thinking we need to get to the strength and conditioning suite 3 times a week, we microdose it, so we don't need it. We don't need as many sessions or individual sessions. We drag and drop it into sessions we're already doing, and by optimizing our warm-ups, we're also improving the physical qualities of our boxing as well. So as I said, we don't necessarily need to see it as boxing strength and conditioning. We can definitely do little bits throughout the week, so that A, we don't have to do as much in our strength and conditioning sessions, or B, we're actually getting the most out of both of our sessions. The final thing I put in is some trunk conditioning. So we know from the boxing science research that effective core mass is correlated highly to punch performance. So if we get rid of things like sit-ups, but we improve the body's ability to resist rotation and to resist extension, so that's the arch of the back, and resisting side bending. The stronger our core is able to decelerate motion, the better the body is going to be at accelerating motion. So if your trunk is able to stiffen up on one side as we're throwing that hook, the greater the response of what's called the stretch shortening cycle. So when the body performs explosive movements, it likes to use the tendons of the body. So the tendons are, if you imagine that slingshot analogy or that rubber band analogy, whenever we load and store elastic energy, it's then going to give us a greater power output when we release it. This is why, for example, if I told you to jump as high as possible, you would probably bend at the hips to load that energy, and then you would jump straight up. You wouldn't squat down, hold it for a couple of seconds, and then jump. The same way for a punch. If I'm throwing a right hand followed by a left hook, as I throw that right hand, I want my, obviously I'm going to extend my right leg, but that left leg is storing the energy, my left side of my trunk is storing the energy to then recoil into the next shot. This is why, for example, punches in combinations are often harder than single shots themselves. Because, for example, if I throw the 1-2, by throwing that jab, I've already preloaded that right hand side to come back with the right hand. And stuff like bear crawls, ab wheel rollouts, side plank, partner pulses, all of that is training your body to resist collapsing when you're in certain positions. We also want our trunk work to incorporate the shoulder and the hips, because at the end of the day, the body is one piece. When I throw a shot, it's linking the foot to the fist, so I need everything in between to be strong, stable, and to stiffen up on impact. Now let's look at an example session from phase 2. So this phase, we're going to improve our force production and our ability to utilize the stretch shortening cycle. So this stretch shortening cycle is the rebound phase. So again, if we go back to the two phase attack analogy I used earlier, if I push out from an opponent, I want my ankles to be stiff, strong, and to be able to rebound back in. This is why we're going to use jumping exercises for the foot and ankle and repeated jumps to improve our ability to store and utilize this elastic recoil. We also want to improve our rate of force development. In phase 1, we improved our ability to produce force, and in phase 2, we're now seeing how quickly we can produce that. So again, if we think about this as a pie chart rather than a flow chart, we've still got our strength exercises in there, but these might be slightly more biased towards how quickly we can move an object rather than just how much weight is on the bar. So again, going back to our force velocity curve, now we might be looking at exercises that are more within the strength speed or the speed strength side of things. So this means we're shifting moderate to light loads fast. We're not necessarily looking for the heaviest loads we can lift. By doing so, if we shift something fast enough, we can still maintain the maximal strength qualities that we built in the first phase. This is also why it's important to consider training residuals. So this is something I discussed in my podcast with Will Wayland, and all physical qualities have a different residual. What that means is, how long does that physical quality last if you don't train it? To give you an example, because of lockdown this year, I hadn't been able to lift weights. I only lost 10% of my deadlift strength in 6 months of not training, because I'd spent so long building such a large reserve. My best deadlift is 220, and after 6 months of not training at all, came back in the gym first day, pulled 200. Strength has such a large residual, and it doesn't disappear very quickly, provided you've spent a long time building it. On the flip side, however, if you didn't sprint for 6 months and then you sprinted first day back, you're probably 1, likely to tear a hamstring, 2, you're going to feel very sore the day after. Whereas if you're sprinting regularly and you're microdosing that throughout the week, as I've suggested, then you're going to stay on top of it. So certain qualities disappear faster than others. Speed qualities seem to disappear very quickly. Explosive qualities seem to disappear very quickly. So I'm not entirely sure whether I believe the notion that a puncher's power is the last thing that leaves them. Although what I do think is if you think about the most explosive boxers, they've almost got more of a reserve to lose. So even if, for example, if you're Mike Tyson, you're this powerful in your prime, and then you stop training, it almost, I don't know, drops to say here. Whereas if you're a flyweight boxer who's not got that much explosive fast twitch fibers, you might start here, stop boxing, and then drift out to here. So again, I'm not sure whether it's technically true that the power is the last thing that leaves you, but I do think that having a big reserve of any physical quality is going to benefit you, because when you get fatigued, you've still got a reserve of that quality. In this phase, we're going to increase the sprint distances slightly so that we can go from those shorter sprints, which are working on our ability to be maximally explosive across a very short time frame, to improving the ability of our heart and lungs to work in short, sharp bursts of near maximal intent, because that's going to improve our ability to spike blood lactate. By improving our ability to spike blood lactate, it allows us to clear lactate, to buffer lactate, and then to go again. Again, if you want more details on this, check out my video on how to improve punch output. In phase 3, we are looking at the ability to reproduce force. This is where stuff might start to look a bit more punch specific, although not, as I said, depending on what movements we do will determine the usefulness of this. Because we've already built the strength, speed and power qualities, this phase is more about allowing us to get rid of some of the fatigue and to express these qualities. So the reason why I say they become more fight specific is because the work to rest ratios start to look more like a fight. So 6 to 10 seconds of work, 10 to 30 seconds of rest. The problem a lot of coaches make is they start here, they've not built any strength, they've not built any speed, they've not built any power. So all they're doing is effectively fatiguing their athletes with what I call lukewarm circuits. I've already made a video about common mistakes made in circuit training, and one of them is the lukewarm approach. It means that the exercises are too long in duration to allow boxers to express their truly explosive qualities, and the circuits are too difficult to allow full recovery between the days. So when we spoke about the high-low system, they're almost the medium days which take too long to recover from, but aren't explosive enough to be truly developing these qualities. So here would be some example sessions in this phase. So at this point in the training program, we've already built to longer sprints, and now we start to take the rest down. So because we're already explosive, we're now training the ability to endure this explosiveness. Remember, you cannot endure a quality that you do not have. So if you're already not explosive, starting training camp by trying to endure a quality you don't have just won't work. Also, this is where the sessions start to look more like a fight in terms of the heart rate profiling and stuff like that. So for example, 4 40-meter sprints with a 2-minute recovery between sets and walking recovery, if you looked at your heart rate, it'd be spiked up and then come back down, spike up, come back down. And it'd look at how quickly you can recover. If you started training camp here, you'd spike it, and then because you're not fit enough, it would come down a little bit, but then you'd spike it again, and the intensity is almost not there after the first effort. We're also looking at both speed strength and strength speed exercises. Again, that's a large variation of percentage. This is going to depend a lot on the athlete you have. Looking at certain athletes in the GB setup, so for example, Cyrus Patterson was from a rugby background, so he might benefit more from being fed more of what he's used to in terms of athletes with more of a strength background seem to benefit more from heavier loading percentage of their 1RM, whereas athletes new to it probably benefit from slightly lighter, faster implements. There's a big range here, again, probably a video for a different topic. Something that the GB boxing team would use a lot is, especially towards the Olympics when they were 2-3 weeks out, was these plyometrical med ball circuits. There seemed to be a big psychological element because one, it seems to feel less stressful than getting under a heavy bar, even though the types of exercises were more intense, especially if you start to measure, for example, the jump heights achieved or the time spent on the floor. And remember, not all jumps are created equally. So the types of exercises in this final phase are going to be highly fatiguing. It's going to be hard to repeat this quality, but you're trying to see how much you can maintain this quality. Again, we still might have a little bit of posterior shoulder work, bicep and tricep work, so stuff like inverted rows, stuff like loaded carries, stuff like tricep dips, just from a perspective of reducing injury risk. So the perceived intensity comes down. So it might not feel as difficult as getting under a heavy barbell, but the intensity is definitely still there. This also allows us to dial up the psychology. So what I mean by that is if we're doing jumps, if we're doing throws, if we're measuring this kind of thing, and boxers know that they're more explosive and they're throwing the ball harder, faster and further, or jumping higher and more quickly than the start of the camp, that's also going to be a huge boost to them psychologically. There could be an element of conditioning depending on what stage of the boxer's camp they're in. So for example, the reason why I say there's an element of conditioning is because to repeat explosive efforts, you need some kind of base of conditioning to allow you to recover from these explosive efforts. Anything you can measure at this stage in camp is worth doing, even if it's a case of you put a cone in front of the boxer, get them to jump it, see if they can repeat it. So some final factors. We need to make sure we've strengthened the deceleration muscles of the body. So this is going to be stuff like the foot and ankle. This is going to be stuff like the core, because for example, if I throw that left hook, the right side of my body is decelerating me. The quicker that can decelerate, the quicker I can reload. We're also wanting to avoid what I call lukewarm type sessions. So for me, it's either got to be high neural activity, so sprinting as fast as you can, jumping as fast or as high as you can, throwing as hard or as fast as you can, or it's on the other end of the spectrum where it's lower intensity. This doesn't mean walking, it just means if we think of sprinting, lifting above 90% of our 1 rep max, or jumping, or it's that kind of more technical side of work, more mobility stuff, more injury risk reduction type work. And finally, the boxing coach and the strength and conditioning coach effectively need to be in bed with one another. If there's something that happens to the boxer in either of these sessions that the other coach doesn't know about, this is severely going to impact the effectiveness of the training program that is put together. Anything the boxer does is training stress, so both parties need to the physical side of things, or are we prioritizing, for example, the technical side of things? It's not that one or the other is more important, it's just that there are only so much training units that a boxer can have. The more that an S&C coach takes away from the boxer, or the more the boxer takes away from the S&C coach, you're going to run into problems if they're not communicating. Personally, I would say the physical needs to come first further away from camp, because you build those physical qualities and then you allow the boxer to express them the closer you get to the fight. A phrase I love is, you don't box to get fit, you need to be fit to box. If a boxer turns up to the first day of camp and they're actually in good shape, then the boxing coach doesn't have to worry about whether they can endure the technical load and break down, because they're already in a good place. If you turn up to an 8-week camp and you're not even fit, then what's going to happen is, while the S&C coach is trying to get you fitter from a gym perspective, the boxing coach is trying to get you fitter from a boxing perspective, and there's just too much training stress in too short a space of time. Secondly, you cannot endure a quality that you have not built. If you haven't built the ability to be explosive, why are you doing conditioning circuits that require you to be repeatedly explosive? What that does is see you in a lukewarm zone where the training stress is too difficult to recover from within such a short space of time, but it's not allowing you sufficient rest to improve your maximal speed qualities. Penultimately, we need to surf the curve. We need exercises that improve our max strength or our ability to produce force at high loads. We need to ensure boxers have the ability to sprint, and we need to train the ability to move light to moderate loads fast. By improving all of this, we improve how much absolute force the boxer can produce, the rate at which this force can be produced, and ultimately we give the boxer the technical qualities to sequence the power from the ground up, and we shift this curve up and to the right. Final point is strength and conditioning on tap, but not on top. At the end of the day, if the best conditioned fighters won fights, which yes, I know it plays a huge part, then we would see strength and conditioning coaches with the best boxers all the time. The amount of time I've seen some absolute quackery going on by elite boxers shows that at the end of the day, the boxing skills will always reign supreme. Strength and conditioning is there to support those technical qualities, not to get in the way of those technical qualities. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this conversation, then please sign up to my Patreon, which you can find at www.com. Try that one again. www.patreon.com/Todd Davidson P2B Coaching, to check out interviews that I've done with people within the world of boxing, mixed martial arts, and other sports. Check out the Platform to Perform podcast on Spotify. If you've enjoyed this, like, subscribe, so you can be first to hear about my new content. And if you want to get in touch with me with any questions that you have, email me via platformtoperform@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you again in the next video.